the mess that's been created in our cities by just putting out, this notion, defund the police, without putting out, and then what? Like, really, and then what?
Well, Vangelis, you just opened up a whole can of worms.
Oh, I mean, I'll go there.
There are abolitionists who've been writing in detail for decades about what defunding the police actually looks like. And exactly what you're describing is what they're advocating for. This isn't just about passing a bill. This is about voting rights legislation that could be the last possible saving grace for a Democratic Party that is failing miserably electorally across the country. And for some reason, we're in the posture of begging him to save his own neck.
You're absolutely right that it's good politics for Joe. It's not just good policy. Now we're going to keep the pressure on him because we only got, 6 weeks or something before the end of the year, and these bills got to get passed. Ms. Gray, where are you from?
Whew, that's a bit of a long story. Most recently, New York. Mm-hmm. But I was born in Washington, D.C. My parents went to Howard and met at Howard.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but
so you're like J. Edgar Hoover. You're just a D.C. person.
Oh, God. God, that is the harshest diss I've ever gotten.
Light-skinned brother from D.C., right? Like, these are your people.
Absolutely not. My mom is from Ohio. My dad was from Virginia. I have no D.C. connections. I just
Where in Ohio? Where in Virginia?
Cleveland and the Tidewater area.
Gotcha. Yeah. You look like a Tidewater girl.
What does that mean?
I'm cousins to Thomas Jefferson through his grandmother. We descend from his grandma by her other children. That's what it means. But the
I don't know if bias history is quite like that. The Grays, I will say, the Grays are the Virginia side.
Yeah.
They keep very strict records of all of their genealogy. They will pull out a picture of a Cherokee in a heartbeat and tell you all the ways that you're related to them, for sure.
Yeah, well, do your DNA. I mean, I did mine, on the Virginia. So my mom's from Petersburg, so a little up the James River from the Tidewater, and we have a crazy family tree. But Henry Louis Gates Jr. Did my DNA in a show and found that, like, my female Kunta Kinte, like the X chromosome where it comes into the U.S. Was, and of course, as a Southern Virginian light-skinned Black person, like, we all descend from Pocahontas, right? And so we've been told that story. But it turned out, so he for 2 years was trying to find Native American mutations because my X chromosome's Asian, which when you're Black almost always means you're Native American, and only 2% of Blacks have Asian. Turns out mine is Polynesian by way of Madagascar, that we descend from the Polynesian pirate founders of Madagascar.
Oh, how interesting.
And this hybrid group, because then they were the first people in Madagascar, then they went to East Africa and brought the East Africans over, and then they intermarried. And these people are still pirates to this day. They're called the Waka Natola, the people of the ancient canoe. But they, only 17 slave ships ever came from Madagascar to what is now the U.S., roughly half to Virginia, half to New York. And the crazy thing is that the Malagasy, slave descendants, all the names like Carters and Birds and stuff, like, correlate with, like, my grandmother's running buddies. Like, it was kind of this interesting thing where you're, like, looking at these slave ships, and you're looking at the plantations they went to and who the descendants are. And you're like, wait a second, like, that's our church, that's the social club. That's like so it was kind of fascinating, super fascinating.
I find that genealogy, the ability for genetic testing to create some kind of linkage with a history that was broken for obvious reasons, historical reasons, to be so fascinating. At the same time, I have this reluctance to give the government my DNA.
Just give it to the Mormons.
I mean, my mom...
they own Ancestry and everything else.
Well, my mom is really into Ancestry.com. She hasn't done any genetic testing yet, but she goes online and she finds people, and she's found various relatives in the New York area and that we now consider to be family. But I had a recent conversation on the podcast with Thomas Chatterson Williams, and we were talking about my ambivalence about doing this, because I do feel like there is an interest in the parts of one's genealogy that is non-Black, that drives some of the public curiosity in doing these kinds of tests, that doesn't sit with me quite right. And so I'm very intrigued about you finding this stuff out about your Madagascar roots. But I have this kind of inner war with myself about to what extent are we doing this to concretize our non-Black ancestry, or to affirm our non-Black ancestry.
You're saying your non-African ancestry.
Because
Black is a Creole definition. White means European, right? But Black, like in Virginia, where your people, my people are from, if you were 1/32nd of African descent, you were Black. So Black has always been a Creole designation, right? Black is like a made-up thing, and it's made up of people who have any African in them.
Well, this is
for me, for me, absolutely. Find out my grandfather's X chromosome goes to Sierra Leone, and it's the Lemba tribe, and about the Lemba tribe. And my grandmother's goes to Madagascar. I mean, I guess I thought, well, I mean, I'm more of an optimist. My perspective on DNA is that the only antidote so race before what it is now. Like if you go back to like the Oxford English Dictionary, when did race first show up in the English language, right? All the way up into the 1700s meant nationality. So it was a British word for like national tribe, even before nations were drawn of tribes. We Scots are a mighty race. We Celts are a mighty race. We Anglo-Saxons are a mighty race. That's the way that it's used. And that's the way that's used in America prior to the creation of race as we know it. Race as we know it doesn't show up, according to the historian Barbara Fields, Black historian, Carthaginius Award winner at Columbia University, doesn't show up until like the middle part of the 1700s, when all of a sudden the slave roles shift from 17 Ghanaians picked up at this, or 17 Cote d'Ivoirians to 17 Negroes picked up in Ghana, 17 Negroes picked up in Cote d'Ivoire. And what it is Anglo-Saxons in England, inspired by the rise of science, try to order all of humanity and all of God's creation. And in the midst of the ongoing slavery enterprise, they situate the Negro between man and monkey. And they decide in that moment, if you will, that we are animals, not people. But prior to that, Africans had been enslaved, like many other groups. The Irish, many other groups had been enslaved throughout European history, and were counted as women and men of nationalities. And again, even through the first century or so of the American experiment, it's only in the 1700s that the modern notion of race shows up. The very barbarous modern notion of race shows up.
Well, this is the argument. This is the conversation we were having on that episode with Thomas Chatterton Williams, because the argument that he makes in his book, he's biracial. It's his, father is Black.
And that's how he identifies. He's Black with a white parent, or he's
this is the thing. The point of his book, I forget the exact title right now, but it's about being an ex-Black person, and it was motivated by the fact that he had a child. Hear me out. This is fascinating because he's kind of proving you're kind of making his argument. So he had a child with a white woman, and the child came out very white presenting, just physiognomically white. And it made him interrogate how he had been defining his own self racially his entire life, because obviously, if it weren't for the fact that he were half white and had more than half white, really, given the fact that his Black father is also mixed in the way that Black Americans are, that it challenged his notion of this kind of Black-white binary and the one-drop rule, and the fact that in some ways we're all perpetuating it by insisting that someone like his daughter still identify as Black, and to challenge these constructions of race and ask the question of whether or not we can be culturally, whatever it means to be culturally Black, and embrace that aspect of one's heritage without subscribing to these racial notions or participating in the kind of racecraft that the Field sisters write about.
Got it. I mean, I don't think biracial gets you there. Biracial is like in South Africa, where you had, white and you had Negro and you had colored, or in Alabama for that reason, they had that kind of tripartite, designation, with colored being an interstitial, biracial category. But you're still recognizing race. And so it gets real confusing, because racism is a lie based on a lie. The first lie, of course, being that race exists, which it doesn't. I mean, people, like the man you're talking about or myself are referred to as, quote, biracial in the modern parlance, they used to call us mulattoes. Mulatto comes from mule, and of course, mules can't have offspring. And so, the notion was that we were sort of two species blended together like a mule is. Well, that ain't true. I've got a couple of kids to testify to that, but
look at Zoe Kravitz.
But on top of that, like when we go back now and call Frederick Douglass like a biracial American hero.
Well, no. And I just want to be clear. His whole point is that he wants to move away from race. He doesn't like that identification. His point.
But biracial cements race.
Right. But I'm using the word biracial, not him.
Yeah,
he's not using the word biracial.
So what does he call himself?
An ex-Black man is the title of the book. And what he's talking about is challenging, is wanting to say you can have that cultural identity. You can go back to the idea of being Ghanaian or Irish or whatever it is without falling into those racial trappings. And, this is an interesting conversation to be having at a moment like we're in now, where a lot of folks are talking about the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict, which came down today, and about how this is evidence of white supremacy. And there's some push and pull around that term and what it is intended to mean in any given moment. But I think it's clear that for some quotient of America, and we can decide we don't care, that term is used in such a broad fashion that in some ways it's creating a group of folks that might not already see themselves as like having a mutual identity. And Thomas Chatterton Williams' argument is that talking about whiteness in that way, and whiteness at work, and white supremacy the way that we do now on the broad left might be doing exactly what Richard Spencer wants, which is to have white people that previously might have only identified as Irish or Polish or whatever they are, or Texan or California or whatever they are, to start identifying as a group that then wants to politicize themselves and leverage power along those lines in a way that really is white supremacist.
I guess I've lived so much of my life dealing with racial strife. My parents' marriage was against the law. That I can only deal with what is like really theoretical conversations. I make my brain hurt. And what I would say is, we have already decided as a society that racial definitions are historical artifacts. So it's been decades. I think it was 1989 when states like Virginia began to strike down the old racial laws. Virginia's law until 1989 was if you were 1/32 of African descent, you were Black. Alabama had a law that said if you had one known ancestor of African descent, you were Black. Again, in modern science would suggest the whole damn state is Black then, because everybody descends from Africa. But literally, Alabama had prosecuted a man who, I think among either his great or his great-great grandparents was one slave. And he had married a white woman. And they put him in prison, for instance, because he had one known ancestor. And apparently ticked off the wrong other guy in town. Maybe it was the other suitor. I don't know what sparked that, but my gosh, right?
Yeah. Well,
and so what I would say is this, that Americans in general need to know more about their ethnic heritage. That ethnicity, whether it's like the Lemba tribe of Sierra Leone, or the Guacanatola of Madagascar, or the Irish, or allow people to ground themselves to a specific place. Whiteness is as obliterating of sort of the continuity of human understanding of who an individual is as Blackness. My mom founded a Black community mental health clinic where I grew up called the Village Project with two other Black therapists. In our county, there had only been 3 Black therapists for more than 30 years, and they were all retiring at the same time. And so they decided they needed to make sure there would always be therapists that were rooted in the Black community. So they created, but the health clinic itself was designated for like poor people. And of course, our folks in that county are disproportionately poor. And one day, a white guy walks in. And as part of the intake, because my mom's, the Village Project, they center, it's Monterey County, California, they center culture. So for example, when they do therapy with a family, they may bring in the pastor, for instance, and they center culture. So their intake is a little longer than other community mental health clinics. And one of the things they ask you is about race and ethnicity and so forth. White guy walks in very upset one day, and he says that he's white. And they say, okay, yeah, but you're like, where are your people from? He's like, I'm just white. Where are your people from? I'm just white. And he's getting increasingly angry. And the president, my mom's the chair, the president of the place walks out, Mel Mason, former Black Panther turned social worker of many decades. And he says to the intake person, I'll take him. Like, don't worry, I'll take him. He starts therapy with this man. The man gets upset, he cusses, and it's not in English. And Mel doesn't know what it is, so he spells it out phonetically. And again, the guy, when he would try to probe, the guy had no recollection of being any connection to any other country, but he says something under his breath when he's frustrated, and it's not English. So Mel ultimately takes that to Google, and he figures out where it's from. So the next therapy session, he says to the guy, say this thing when you get upset. Do you know what that means? The guy says, no. It's just something that men in it's like a sound like my father would make, my grandfather would make when he was upset. And Mel said, well, I'm relieved to hear that because this is what it means. And as you can see, you should never say that to another living human being ever again. He said, however, what it also means is that you're speaking, I believe it was Gaelic, and that means that you're Irish.
What was the, what did the word mean? What was the expression?
I don't know, but it was something probably about your mother, right? I mean, generally in most cultures, if it's something you should never say again, you're insulting somebody's mother. I grew up playing soccer with a bunch of Latino guys, Chicanos play the dozens as fierce as black folks. And that's how I learned Spanish, was trying to figure out what the heck they were saying about my mom. But let's just say it was about his mother. But the point is, he said to the guy, look, for the remainder of your sessions here, your homework is to figure out what it means to be Irish and what that means to you. It was immensely healing. I just finished a book. It comes out on HarperCollins next year. And it's a series of parables. And I talked about this in it. And one of the things that, I've become convinced is that one of the ways that we heal race in America, that we sort of heal the damage race has done. We heal the damage race has done in America. The notion of race, this barbaric yet modern notion of race, much more problematic than the historic notion of race as nationality, is that we really should make sure that every child understands their ethnic origins, even if it's just what DNA tells you. Because again, blackness, the institution of slavery, obliterated a lot of people's, not everybody's. Thurgood Marshall knew, for example, his great grandfather had been captured in the Congo. Like, not everybody, but for most of us, it was pretty obliterated, or it was replaced by like fanciful notions that we descend from Pocahontas or whatever. And similarly, for a lot of white folks, their cultural knowledge has been obliterated too, and all they know of this guy who walked into my mom's mental health clinic is that they're white. And for him, knowing that he was Irish was very healing. Part of what we struggle with as Americans is that social isolation in America is a much greater problem than it is anywhere else on the globe. And there's a lot of bad things with homicide and suicide that come from that social isolation, that are accelerated as problems are cited by the social isolation. And while to take nothing away from the pain that I've suffered by friends being, Black friends being murdered. My best friend was murdered during the 2016 Bernie campaign. Like, I've had a lot of friends murdered. What I also know as a trained criminologist is that when you look at mortality stats, race, gender, age, from bullets, the biggest category is not Black men dying from homicide between the ages of 15 and 35, which is when we die of homicide most frequently. No, it's white men over 55 dying from suicide.
Yeah.
And the thing that suicide correlates with most highly is social isolation. And so, that's, I think that if we're going to heal this country, we all need to get reacquainted with from whence we come.
So this is very provocative, and I want to keep exploring this, but I should probably, in all likelihood, introduce you to our audience so they know who is dropping this knowledge on them right now. I'm very glad to be joined today by Ben Jealous, youngest ever, I believe, president of the NAACP, former gubernatorial candidate in Maryland, all around fascinating man, historian, as we've heard, criminologist. You described yourself as just now?
Yeah, that's my graduate degree from Oxford. Yep.
Oh, okay. All right. And Oxford man. Well, welcome to the show. And thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here.
So I'm curious, for you think that social isolation would be helped or mitigated in some way by people having a better understanding of their ethnic identity. Is the idea that if we just had another fact that we knew about ourselves, another identity group that we knew about ourselves, it would enable us to connect with similarly situated people in our surroundings. And how is that not going to break down in the kind of factionalism that used to exist in America when there was plenty of animus between Irish folks and Italian folks and every other kind of white person?
The way it helps is, first of all, it tethers you to a place in the club. If your family has broken down, and white families started to break down about 2 generations before black families, because white families suburbanized 2 generations before black families, because segregation artificially, if you will, kept us ghettoized. And you can now see it in black families when, like, grandma dies, right? And family tries to get disconnected because she was the one holding the tribe together.
So that's so interesting, because ordinarily the idea of being suburbanized is associated with being with a strong, concrete family unit. And it's the urbanized Black and brown communities that are described as derelict, in part because of their association with an urban environment.
So if you go back, Kenneth Clark's book, Dark Ghetto, he talks about the misery index and the anomaly in the misery index, right? Black folks suffering from all these different things, is that our suicide rates were way lower than they were of whites. And so, my mom grew up in McCullough Homes housing projects in West Baltimore. It's the first half of her childhood. If you watch The Wire, that's known as the low rises. And then she grew up in the tenements not far therefrom. And I was raised, my parents' marriage was against the law. They had to leave Maryland under the old anti-miscegenation laws in 1966. And they ultimately settled in Northern California. My father was working on a military base out there. And I grew up, in Pacific Grove, California, which I think is now famous for some little show, Big Little Lies or something like that.
Oh, interesting.
And so, growing up there, we had a lawn, we had great sports leagues, we had cute parades and Kiwanis pancake breakfast before the Little League season. And my mom felt like I had everything that she didn't have. And in many ways I did. And then one day we go to church, and there's only one other Black person at the church. And it's my grandfather's second cousin from West Baltimore, who's the assistant minister. And it hits my mom that I lacked the one thing that she took for granted, that she never realized this man was a second cousin. She had so many first cousins in West Baltimore. Second cousins were like irrelevant strangers. And yet he had been the father of one of her childhood friends. That's how she recognized him. And then he explained to her, well, your granddad and I are first cousins. And she was like, or your father and I are first cousins. And she was like, her head exploded. And that's why I would ship back to West Baltimore every summer, because my mom wanted to make sure that I had a sense of place, I had a sense of tribe, a sense of family. And I also experienced what it was like to have people up in the soup like all the time, as opposed to our suburban existence where you better call before you come by. And so, they say poverty is the most powerful form of historic preservation. Well, the history of the human family is that we live in a tribal, close way with all sorts of relations all on top of each other, much more common in the hood than it is in the suburbs.
And why ethnic identity as opposed to any other kind of identity, right? Because you might have someone say, well, we should have some kind of national service requirement, not necessarily military, but everyone has to plant trees or whatever, so that you can have that kind of group identity, the way that you go to camp and form bonds with people, or have an identity based on your state, or you go off to college and form some kind of school-based identity. Some people would say there's a certain inherent danger in a kind of ethnic focus, just given how ethnic balkanization is at the root of so many problems globally. And what you've just described isn't even necessarily an ethnic loss that you felt having moved to California. It was, I mean, the blackness is hard because it's like race and Black, and it's a little different, right?
Wait, so let's I was talking about social isolation. You ask deep questions and I give long answers. So
no worries, they're good.
Feel free to. But what I would say is this: on the ethnic side, what you're really talking about is, in this great melting pot of America, frankly, the value in us being a bit more of a mosaic. If Frederick Douglass gave an incredible speech against the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1860s. It was triggered by the passage of the 14th Amendment, and then the passage of the putting forward of the Chinese Exclusion Act right after. And in that speech, he said a lot of things. We could do a whole segment on it, but there are a couple of things that are really important. One was this notion that we all come from somewhere, and that as a nation, we're strongest as a strong nation that like knits people together and welcomes them with open arms. It has a common language, has a common culture. So yes, I actually do believe in national youth service. I do believe in things that would turn us into more of a nation and less of an empire, if you will. But at the same time, if you ever want to get beyond this very barbaric modern notion of race created in the 1700s that defined Blacks as subhuman, you've got to replace it with something. And what has existed for, I don't know, 50 million years or something is like, where are you from? Right? Whether that was a nation, whether that was a tribe, whether that was just like over the hill, right? Like what group of people are you connected to? And so ethnicity in that respect is much healthier. Now, what I would say also is, again, you need the two things for it to work. On the one hand, people, for a whole bunch of reasons, benefit from just having a notion of who they descend from and what that means culturally and everything else, and who else that might connect to. Like I can look at DNA cousins in France and Madagascar and different places and go track them down if I wish. But the other, I would say, is that, no empire, no country becomes a nation until we have an experience that defines us as a group, right? That defines, who the Irish and who the Africans become here. And you can look at American history prior to the creation of race. You can look at the rebellions in Virginia in the mid 1600s, for instance, and see something very different. If you go back and you look at the early days of the Virginia colony, two things really kind of strike you. One is that this was a world before the modern definition of race. Premarital sex, for example, between a Black man and a white woman, what we say now, but again, those terms in Negro and so forth wasn't a thing then, and between an African slave and a free white woman, was a free European woman, was punished the same way as it was between African and African, or European and European. Ye shall both don white robes of shame and stand in the the church house doors for the appointed number of days or hours. The other thing that you see is that families, the first people of color, the way that Barack Obama on his white mother's side descends from an African slave, is that originally somebody's designation, slave or free, had to do with their mother. So if an African man impregnated a European woman and the African man was a slave and she was free, the children, even though they were born brown skin and curly hair, were born free. In Maryland, there's a family that ours is interwoven with called the Proctors. They were like that, for instance. They all go back to the same white woman who had multiple children with an African slave, who were all born free, the earliest, if you will, free people of color in the United States. And the other thing you see is that the rebellions in the beginning were Irish indentured servants and African slaves rising up together. And the sort of the predecessor to the modern notion of race was splitting those two groups. A series of rebellions in the 1660s and 1670s in Virginia. Last big one was Bacon's Rebellion, somewhat famous because it occurs exactly 100 years before the American Revolution. And what they did after Bacon's Rebellion in earnest was to legislate a difference between Irish and a greater difference of status, of clothing, of relationship to the courts between Irish indentured servants and African slaves, so as to put one above the other and separate the two groups. And if you look across English colonial experiments, it's very common that when they have two large groups that are prone to rebel together, they will go to the smaller of the two. And at the time, the Irish were smaller than the Africans. And they will align them with them. This is what they did with the Sunni over the Shiites. This is what they did with the Hindu, with the the Hindus over the Muslims or vice versa. I know my American history better right now than my world history. But they would go to the smaller of the two groups,
Tutsis
elevate them, convince them that they needed the Englishmen to be safe. That's what they did to the Irish in Virginia. And that was all before race as we know it existed. And so why is that important? I was taught political science by a guy named Charles Hamilton, who was a co-author of Black Power. And he was also one of the architects of the Obama campaign, the Dinkins campaign, and played a role, the Jesse Jackson campaign and the Dinkins campaign, and played a role in Wilder and Harold Washington's campaigns in 1989. So Jesse Jackson, 1948, Wilder, Dinkins, and Harold Washington, 1989. There he was teaching poli-sci in 1990. And he would say, politics is a lot like physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And something in motion will return to its original state. See, Mr. Jealous, as Americans, we often, we forget the original state of race relations, and that's a problem because race relations is always in motion. So as Americans, we only remember what's on the big screen or the small screen. And so that back then meant roots. Today, you could say Django or 12 Years a Slave. Invariably, they show slavery at the end. And he said something that my grandmother, who turned 105 a few days ago, oldest Delta in the country.
Congratulations. Happy birthday.
Yeah. Oh, man. She's this woman is so, you go to my Twitter at Ben Jealous and see her. She is so sharp. It's crazy. But my grandma and Professor Hamilton would say the same thing, which is never forget, in the beginning, they weren't slave rebellions, they were colonial rebellions. And so, and why in Gloucester did the Irish indentured servants and the African slaves rebel together? Because an edict had come down from the governor of Virginia that had been handed to him, sent to him by the King of England, that said that, and your status, the lowest status, if you will, of either parent shall convey to the children. In other words, from the very beginning, the original state of the American people is we will endure a lot so long as we can hope that our children might be better off. This was a time when slavery was more porous. This was a time when indentured servitude was more vague as far as when it might end. Everybody had a reason to hope maybe their kids might be better off. But the moment that it becomes clear that our children are condemned to a fate no better than our own, likely worse, then we will rebel, and we will rebel together. That is the lesson of Gloucester. And I would say that's the original state of the American people, a time when race mattered much less, and what we had in common mattered much more. And that's what keeps me optimistic.
Let me ask you then what you make of this moment we're in now, not just how the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict has exposed, again, these deep rifts in how Americans see a given factual situation, see their relative respective victim status, but the broader world we've inherited kind of post-Trump, where there's still these ongoing conversations about what the path forward is for the broad left. It seems increasingly like there's a view by Democrats, elected Democrats, that the quote-unquote Trump voter has become something separate and apart from the conservative of yore. The kind of voter that's a swing voter, the kind of voter that can be persuaded by various things. I remember you giving a very compelling speech, I think it was during the course of Bernie 2016, about how when you were traveling with Bernie on the campaign trail and he would give these speeches about all his issue areas, he would get to a part about Black Lives Matter. And the first time you saw him do that in a predominantly white, all white, maybe even space, you got nervous and kind of clenched up, worried that people weren't going to cheer as robustly as they had for the other parts of the speech. And when they did, you said you were almost, ashamed that you had doubted, but very pleasantly surprised.
I was in the Ozarks, yes, and the men were in deer hunting camouflage. But yes.
And yet, so what's your, I see that. I remember hearing that story. I remember you telling that story and feeling like, yes, that's my feeling of the world too. That's my understanding of the world too, that whether it's Bacon's Rebellion, whether it's someone like Bernie Sanders offering something that's more advantageous than the wages of whiteness, as it were, that there are opportunities to bring people together. But I am told often the reaction to me saying things like that, especially in a moment like we're in right now, is extreme cynicism and a belief that what is going on with these white folks amongst us is so deep and so intrinsic that to appeal to them necessarily means you must have somehow thrown people of color under the bus. You somehow must be catering to racism because racism is all that's left in them. And I wonder if you perceive that orientation as well, and perceive that kind of cynicism coming out of the Democratic Party, and what you think the antidote to this kind of political bifurcation is.
So again, you ask deep questions and I give long answers. So we're going to try to
we have
unpack
time.
this a bit. What I would say is this. There's an old game played. You can look back through every century, again, back to at least the 1700s and see it played. Because the game I'm talking about involves race as we know it, and it's only existed since the 1700s. But and it's a game of divide and conquer. But divide and conquer, of course, existed before notions of race, modern notions of race. And you can find people who stood against it. My friend Bob Zellner, there's a series about his life called Son of the South. He was one of the founders of SNCC, one of the white founders of SNCC. He was born the son of a Methodist preacher who was a Ku Klux Klansman. His father, when he was very young, lost his mind. His father participated in a lynching and lost his mind. I've sat with other white folks who witnessed lynchings or who were children of people who bragged about lynchings and saw and listened to the impact it had on them. And it's searing. You cannot dehumanize somebody else without dehumanizing yourself. And lynching is the ultimate act of dehumanization. And Stacey Abrams and I interviewed a man. She sat with me while I interviewed a man when I was president of the NAACP who was 7 when he heard his father come back and bragged about a lynching that involved cutting the unborn baby out of a woman's stomach. And watching this man retell the story, you could see how it shattered his whole world and has permanently, harmed his relationship with his father and his uncles, to see them kind of bare their teeth as such, sort of naked, sociopathic, psychopathic predators. It's not an image any child wants to of their father. He would celebrate a baby being cut out of a woman's belly while she was tied to a tree and murdered. But that's what happened at the Morse Ford Bridge and down in Georgia. And so similarly, Bob Zellner, his dad, lost his mind after participating in a lynching. And this man regained his sanity and his self-respect and a sense of purpose in the world by leading his family, including a young Bob Zellner, into the civil rights movement before Brown versus Board. And Reverend Zellner, the father, would preach back then that if a white person has their hand on the neck of a black man holding him down the South, he needs to recognize that he's down in the ditch with him. And then he would say, a rich man walks down the middle of the road and laughs at both men in the ditch, the black one and the white one. Dr. King, in addition to letter at Birmingham jail, I think after Selma, Reverend Barber reminded me this the other day, talked about how suppression of black votes has always been ultimately a strategy for suppressing the power of working people of all colors in our society. And the receipts on that, you can look at the 1902 Virginia Constitutional Convention, which, again, my grandmother's grandfather, born enslaved in Virginia, served as a Black state legislator among the very last in Virginia at the end of Reconstruction. And she still carries the pain of her grandfather, the pain of him having watched his white colleagues, many of them, vote to suppress the votes of his constituents so that men like him couldn't serve again. And in that, Senator Glass, who would go on to be Treasury Secretary under Woodrow Wilson, but was a senator in 1902. Woodrow Wilson being the last great truly white supremacist president before Donald Trump, in a very aggressive, nasty way. And Senator Glass, similar. Senator Glass introduced 5 voter suppression amendments to the Virginia Constitution in 1902, one of which still exists in Virginia, the lifetime ban on formerly incarcerated people voting. Each of them not racialized on their face, right? They were the grandfather clause, the poll tax, etc., the ban on formerly incarcerated people voting, conceded that this would suppress the votes of thousands of his white neighbors, and then yet rationalize that it would harm the black vote more, and therefore was justified and necessary to, quote, reestablish white supremacy as the law of the land in every county in Virginia. The game that's played by liberals and conservatives is that the best friend to the poor white man is a rich white conservative, and the best friend to a poor black man is a rich white liberal. And it doesn't really hold up when you think about it, because the interests ultimately are in people who share kitchen table concerns. Banding together, that's the only way that things get better around either kitchen table. And that's, if you will, the divide and conquer of the moment. And what we ultimately have to get beyond. And so what I saw in the Ozarks, which you so aptly described, was a great possibility. I mean, it reminded me, one, that people do yearn to be connected, do yearn to stand up for each other, do recognize each other's humanity. It also reminded me, like one of my cousins in West Baltimore when I was a kid, like always watched the Dukes of Hazzard. Like everybody had issues with Boss Hogg. This type of authoritarian policing. Let us never forget that between Philando Castile and George Floyd in Minneapolis, a white woman was shot in her car by the police because she refused to comply with their commands, by a black officer, by the way. And why did she refuse to comply? She was having an epileptic seizure. At the end of the day, authoritarian policing is a threat. I mean, we are the canaries in the coal mine. We get it worse, but we're not the only ones who get it.
Was that the one officer, wasn't he of East African descent, who actually did go to jail?
Yeah.
I seem to recall that. But look, here, so I want to ask you this, though, then, because we have the response today from a lot of liberals, the response back when Rittenhouse shootings first happened, from even people like Joe Biden, who the right is now in a frenzy because he included a picture of Kyle Rittenhouse in an ad targeting white supremacy and Trump's unwillingness to disclaim white supremacy. The narrative is that white supremacy, this kind of undefined, very definable, but largely undefined in the discourse quantity, is responsible for all of these things in a way that some might argue shores up the idea that there is an identity of interest between a rich white man like Donald Trump and a working class white kid like Kyle Rittenhouse. And while I have no issue personally understanding phenomena and describing the world in in terms like white supremacy, from a communications perspective, I also understand that is a way that I can get through to someone who already agrees with me. But I'm not sure what it's doing other than reinforcing that very pattern, that identity of interest that hurts me in the long run. And there are people who will say, well, Briahna, you shouldn't be choosing words to cater to racists, to make racists happy. And my question is always, I guess, well, what's your plan for racists? What are we going to do about the racists? What's your plan? Are we want them just to die off? Because that doesn't seem to be happening. They seem to be growing in number. Do you want them to just stay home and not vote and hope that we get enough non-racists to come out? Do you have a conversion plan to make them not racist? And what does that look like? I would love to help, but I'm not really sure what that looks like. Do you try to at least get the racists who voted for Obama? Let's say they're all racist. You try to get them to vote for Obama like they did, vote for the next Democrat like they voted for Obama. Because you didn't seem to mind that these same people that voted for Trump were racist when they voted for Obama. So are we actually trying to recruit them and flip them and make them Democrats by offering them something substantive from a policy perspective? $15 minimum wage, affordable prescription drugs, whatever it is? Like what is the plan? Because I don't know that there's much utility in saying and describing things like all of, a bunch of squad members, people that I like, got on the internet today and said, this is evidence of white supremacy, which I don't disagree with necessarily. I don't know what it's doing.
Question. I mean, the Southerner in me, it begs the question, like, and so what? And so what? Like, what's the significance of that? Now, I gotta say, as a university professor, as an overly educated Negro, I have like little patience for sort of the overeducated left honing their complaints without honing solutions. To whom much is given, much is expected. And I can certainly tell my own tale of woe. But let's be honest. If you have a college degree in America, a lot's been given to you. And so what should we expect from you? Well, Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the architect of Howard University Law School and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where I started my career, said, for example, of Black lawyers, unless you are a social architect, you are a social parasite. And I feel it's the same way with intellectuals who just want to complain and like diagnose problems and are not willing to really invest themselves or even have the courage to really pursue a solution. You know, you see it with the mess that's been created in our cities by just putting out, you know, this notion, defund the police, without putting out, and then what? Like really, and then what?
Well, Ben Jealous, you just opened up a whole can of worms.
Oh, I mean,
here.
I'll go there. Like,
let's do it. Here we go. Because the abolitionists will say they have plenty of plans and scholarship about what this looks like. There was
how do you call yourself an abolitionist these days? Honestly, if you've never abolished anything, like I've led successful campaigns to abolish the death penalty in multiple states in one, and the juvenile death penalty as a whole. I know what it takes to abolish something. These people call themselves abolitionists, and they disgrace the notion even of anti-slavery abolitionists because they don't actually have a vision, a practical vision for what replaces it.
Have you not been following, let's say, the ballot measure, I believe it was in Minnesota, that got like 43% of the vote? I mean, like people poo-pooed that as a real loss, but almost 50% of a community.
I mean, we were supporting it. I mean, here's the thing. This is what I'm talking about. Have you ever read James Foreman Jr.'s book, Locking Up Our Own?
No.
Okay, so what that's about is why it is that not just Joe Biden, George Bush, Bill Clinton supported mass incarceration, not just why Charlie Rangel, Maxine Waters supported mass incarceration, but ultimately how it was that all those folks felt compelled to support it because older Black women in mass supported it and older Black men in mass supported it because they were scared. And what happens with crime survivors in neighborhoods that are high crime areas, turns out they just say yes to everything. Like if you poll them and you say, you know what, should every inmate get a college education? They would say yes. Why? Because they're coming back to their neighborhood and they want them to come back with better job prospects than they had when they left. You know, should we just lock them all up like tomorrow? You know, anybody on the street doing anything, you know, 2 rocks of crack, get you 5 years. Yes. And so having spent 30 years of my life in the fight to stop police violence, it terrified me when I saw the slogan, defund the police, because I knew they would do what it's done, which is to frankly scare a lot of old Black folks and push them to the right. And so what do we see, right? We see, you know, police endorsed folks taking out our most progressive mayors, right? You get Eric Adams, you don't get Maya Wiley.
Wait a minute. Ben Jealous, you think that that Eric Adams won and Maya Wiley lost because of defund the police and not because Scott Stringer, who was the left candidate in the lead, was succumbed to a Me Too scandal that ultimately didn't amount to much to anything, but the left immediately turned tail and abandoned him. There was a failure to coalesce around an alternative candidate until the 11th hour. Diane Morales' campaign, who was potentially the other left insurgent, got taken down by her own internal mishigas and on and on and on. Like, I don't know that you can lay blame for Eric Adams' success on the slogan, defund the police, especially when none of the candidates ran a defund the police platform, none of them. And all of them had very similar, the plurality of the at least more liberal candidates had a very similar stance on how much they wanted to decrease police funding in New York. They all just said like $1 million. Like they all said the same thing.
Except, I would say this, you have to look at the posture of the candidates, and you have to look at the impact that it had on pushing people towards more centrist candidates. You can look at the opinion polls right after George Floyd, where there was massive consensus to really move quickly to stop police violence. And then you can look at the impact that Defund the Police had on pushing people back towards the center and the right.
Finn, that is not my recollection of what happened. My recollection of what happened is that you're correct that after George Floyd's murder went viral, there was a lot of public consensus around sympathy for protests, sympathies for even some property damage style protests, and defund the police as a slogan was polling at around 40%, which was pretty high. Subsequently, Joe Biden pit the idea of protesting and defund against the idea that he would be reelected and be able to beat Trump. And suddenly voters had to choose between solidarity with these protests, which they were told by a 24-hour news cycle on MSNBC and CNN was going to hurt Joe Biden's chances, and getting Trump out of office. And over the course of Joe Biden antagonizing the slogan and Don Lemon and everybody else getting on TV and saying how bad the slogan was, of course, public opinion of the slogan went down.
No, I don't think that Joe Biden drove that at all. When you look at somebody,
Joe Biden, who came out today after the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict and crossed his arms and said, the jury system works in America.
Totally wacky. Yeah, like severely problematic. Just like it was problematic when Joe Biden. Look, Joe Biden is a blue dog Democrat, and he's gonna be a blue dog Democrat, and his sensibilities are out of touch often with history. He's made two very problematic historical statements on two issues I spent my whole life working on in the last 6 months. One was today about juries, right? And it's like, oh my gosh, does this man even understand the history of lynchings and everything else in our society? That like juries do a good job or whatever the heck he said. Crazy. The other thing was back in August when he was really buttonholed at a CNN town hall meeting about voter suppression laws and the need for a strong federal response. And he said, literally, you just can't stop the people from voting. So yes, Joe Biden makes problematic statements, but what I'm telling you as a guy who goes to church in the poorest zip code in Baltimore, where my family's gone to church for 85 years, with a whole bunch of little old ladies, is that defund the police, when it hit the pews of that church in Sandtown, Baltimore, right, Harlem Park, Baltimore, they were terribly confused. They were so ready to follow young activists. They also are so afraid of bullets flying to the neighborhood, of home invasions, of carjackings, that you cannot give people half a solution. You've got to give them a whole solution.
But if people are so confused, why isn't there more narrative work being done to explain that defund the police does not mean, and abolitionists have never argued that it means we do lawlessness and just a libertarian gun show, every man for themselves, in the streets nonsense, that we're talking about the fact that police budgets have swelled over the course of the last decades with absolutely no correlation to a decrease in crime, and that people who are concerned about crime shouldn't be trying to address that concern by throwing more money at the police, that all that's doing is getting police driving military-style tanks through their neighborhood and absolutely no decrease in the social problems that they're identifying. And that if they want less crime in their neighborhoods, they should want to shift that funding from the police to anti-poverty measures, which are correlated with the rise of crime. Right? Like that is the conversation we should be having.
Message discipline, right?
Right, it is. But we endlessly have a conversation about whether or not defund the police is a good slogan, using a lot of words and oxygen and energy that could be telling those afraid older voters that defund is actually a safety mechanism. And funding the police does not make you safer.
Or we could just use a slogan that's literally not going to cut us off at the knees, which is what the civil rights community has had good discipline doing for like most of its hundreds of years. But, occasionally we make mistakes like any movement does. I would say this one is a mistake. And what we've done at People for the American Way, what our young elected officials have done, what our African-American Ministers Leadership Conference has done, is to actually go out there. And we did this in the midst of this because we were terrified by the impact. Mayor Savante Myrick, who's on our team, he replaced Andrew Gillum, who had been on People's Force staff for 17 years, all for the time he was mayor, before he ran, and city council, and before that, up until he ran for governor. Has introduced a legislative package up in Ithaca, New York. And the reason you might say, oh, it's a little college town. The reason why college towns are so important is because when you're trying to transform criminal justice policy, college towns are where you want to start because they're the most comfortable with experimenting. So, for example, the ban the box movement, which I played a big part in while I was president of the NAACP, and when I was a foundation president before that, we started with college towns for that reason. Eventually, we had Walmart in the state of California, making it easier to employ formerly incarcerated people. But you got to start somewhere. So the laboratory, when it's bottom up, it's college towns. And what do we put forward? We put forward that you have a public safety department, not a police department. That you have a civilian head, not a law enforcement head. That you have two divisions. One is, police officers. One is armed. The other one is social workers. And then over time, you replace about half of the police with social workers through attrition.
But that's just defund. That is defund.
That's a solution.
You don't have to call it
half an idea. It's half an idea.
It's not. But then
come on, it's half an idea. Defund and what?
There are abolitionists who've been writing in detail for decades about what defunding the police actually looks like. And exactly what you're describing is what they're advocating for.
But
now,
again,
if you want to call it something else, I don't really care. I don't.
But you should care, is my point.
No.
You should, just like you should care that Dr. King, right, said, let's put Rosa Parks on the bus and not just take anybody who's having a problem on the bus.
Well, no. Here's the thing. I did not bring defund up in this conversation.
I know I did.
You did. So I am very happy moving through the world, avoiding subjects, avoiding language that I think is not going to work for my audience. What I do not do is use my platform to heap on antagonism to phrases that don't matter.
Family, right? This is a family podcast, right? This podcast, I can't imagine like as many, I don't know, Southern like police chiefs listening to your podcast.
No, but there are a lot of libertarians that listen to this podcast. There are a lot of people across the political spectrum because they perceive me to be a fair dealer,
smart,
right?
incisive,
and the reality
honest,
is,
which is why I'm here. And I'm just saying, let's be honest within the broad range of folks. On criminal justice, I've worked criminal justice reform with all those folks you've mentioned: libertarians, Christian conservatives, fiscal conservatives. In addition to from the left of the left of the left, right? And everybody with a hole for the moderates who tend to be addicted when they're in office to like prison industrial complex money. So I don't mess with them on criminal justice reform because they will tie you up all day long. But all I'm saying is, when you want to abolish something, you got to be able to say like defund and.
Well, the defund movement is doing that, and I hope that next time you are on TV and have the kind of platform that I am not afforded, and someone says defund is a bad slogan, you suggest to them that poll numbers aren't telling the same story. Joe Biden also got his advocacy for fracking caused support for banning fracking to decline by 20 percentage points. Now, did fracking suddenly become a good idea because Joe Biden was like, fracking is good, and over the course of like 4 or 5 months convinced an additional 20% of Americans that we had to frack? No. But people who are in respected positions of power, spending their time and energy maligning ideas, slogans, whatever it is, will affect poll numbers. And so I'm just unconscious of that, as well as I think I can be honest about the fact that, of course, there are some people who are going to be hesitant about defund. But my job as a communicator, I think, is not to poo-poo the idea or to say that it's not a well-thought-out idea, because it very much is. And the extreme slogan is abolish the police. Defund is the compromise. And Republicans...
That's a distinction without a difference. When you're, a working class Black grandmother at my church in Sandtown, they just simply want to know, well, what are you going to replace it with?
And then I would answer. And I would answer.
But it can't be long. It's got to be as short as defund the police.
You just sat here when you were explaining your program at Ithaca, used a lot of words to explain your version of. That's literally all you have to say.
So what we would say is half of modern police work is social work, and therefore half the department should be social workers.
Ben, that's literally what these defund people are saying, and I have to believe that you know that.
They're talking like academics, not like organizers. I'm an organizer.
But they're not. There's plenty of organizers who are out there who have been doing this work for a really long time.
But what I'm saying is that if you're actually working as an organizer and you're focused on a solution, what you run into is you better start talking about your solution. And so defund the police And to me, an organizer is somebody who actually gets things. A lot of people who call themselves organizers who only lose, right?
Ben, come on.
No,
that is not fair.
Win, right. When you win, it is fair because there better be a high bar. There's a high bar for me as a young organizer, right? And so, and I want them to win. And I'm working with them every day, and we're actually got something passed that is now moved through. And we got unanimous support. And we got unanimous support by organizing Black folks and white folks and bombarding that city council with common sense. But we had to talk to them about what we were for. And so you can't just talk about what you're against. It's a real simple rhetorical point that you can talk about problem, you better talk about the solution too.
That's fine. And the Defund people, when given an opportunity to actually defend themselves on TV, instead of just having millionaires like Don Lemon sit around with their arms crossed, people who have never had to experience living in a crime-ridden environment, or to have as direct exposure to the kind of police surveillance and oppression that folks who, like myself and my siblings, grew up in New York.
No matter how rich they are, has had to deal with police surveillance. I mean, let's not forget what Michael Bloomberg did.
Yeah, let's not forget what Michael Bloomberg did. Why don't you remind Don Lemon and the rest of them who were so quick to turn the tides? The point that you made earlier about this identity, wait a minute, this point that you made earlier about the identity of interest between being told that white affluent liberals represent the interests of working class people, it's also a lot of Black affluent liberals who are told that they represent the interest of Black people. And I would argue too, there are a lot of people who are representing and providing cover for not just antagonism of certain political realities, but for entire political campaigns, who paved the way for someone like Joe Biden to pave the way for Joe, juries are just doing their job, it's a great system, Biden, Jim Crow Joe, to be the obstructionist that he is being today. And that's why I want to pivot before we run out of time here to the issue of voting rights, which is what you've been championing most strongly so far. I know you were down the street at the protest earlier this week on Wednesday for voting rights reform. I want you to remind everybody where we are with that and what you see as the real obstacle and who you see as the real obstacle to actually getting these voting rights bills passed.
Well, look, I've been arrested outside the White House now, I think 4 times in the last couple of months. There have been a lot of protests up on Capitol Hill about the need to pass voting rights legislation. I'm supportive of it. But there becomes a point when only the president of the United States can actually get the job done. Mm-hmm. We saw it on the infrastructure bill, and we're there with voting rights. These voting rights bills have to be passed by the end of the year, or we will see a massive onslaught of racially tinged, hyper-partisan redistricting, just like we did in 2010. And what that means is that the president of the United States has to call on the Senate to clear a path for an up or down vote on the voting rights bills for which we have a majority. Kamala Harris, I want to be clear, has done her job. She's got 51 senators, and that's not an easy thing to do as president of the Senate when 2 of them are Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. But she's done that. Now Joe Biden has to do his job, and so our protests have been calling on the
Joe Biden's job being
his job is to call on the Senate to clear a path for an up or down vote. That means to either fix or nix the filibuster. Get the filibuster out of the way, so we can have an up or down vote. It is absolutely a Jim Crow filibuster. And President Biden has said good things, but he has to walk that talk. Martin Luther King III was with us getting arrested 2 protests ago.
He's been on this podcast.
Yeah. Oh, he's a sweet guy, good guy, very clear thinking guy. And like his dad, a bit soft spoken, when it's one-on-one. And Martin said, reminded people that his father, when the 1964 Voting Rights Act was passed, went to President Johnson and said, great, now let's pass the Voting Rights Act. President Johnson said, I agree that we need it, but I have nothing left. I can't help you. And when Martin Luther King Jr. walked out, as his son recalled the other day at this protest, said, well, we're just going to have to make him do it. So we're in the just make Joe do it mode.
Okay,
and
here's the thing. We're talking about LBJ facing, I don't think that LBJ was saying, I have the votes and I just don't want to get rid of the filibuster.
Yep.
He's saying there's a political reality that has to change such that the pressure, it's clear to everyone that the consequences of not doing this thing are worse than the consequences of doing it. And so I'm going to go, I have the political cover to do the thing you want me to do. Right now, that's not the issue. You're telling me that you have 51 votes to actually pass this thing. And Joe Biden, through sheer obstinacy or I don't know what, is deciding not just to, this isn't just about passing a bill. This is about voting rights legislation that could be the last possible saving grace for a Democratic Party that is failing miserably electorally across the country. So it's to his own benefit and to his own party's benefit to pass this legislation. And for some reason, we're in the posture of begging him to save his own neck.
You're absolutely right that it's good politics for Joe. It's not just good policy, but it's actually the basic American principle. And yes, we're demanding it, which is what the civil rights movement does. We have seen him move, not quite far enough, but it's about 80% of the way.
What's the movement?
August, CNN Town Hall, he was like, you just can't stop people from voting. By 2 weeks ago at CNN Town Hall, he said, we may have to create a carve out in the filibuster or reform the filibuster in order to get the vote that we need. That's very good. Now we're going to keep the pressure on him because we only got, 6 weeks or something before the end of the year. And these bills got to get passed now.
So what do you understand? Because to convince someone's mind, to change someone's mind, I imagine you'd have to have some understanding or at least some prediction of what's going on inside, what's motivating them. Given that it's not just good policy, it's good politics for Joe Biden. Given that what do you think is motivating his reluctance to do this very obvious thing that he should do? He has described it as the Jim Crow, filibuster is a Jim Crow relic.
Yes. So I would say one is just the distraction of being president, right? Everybody's clamoring for everything. Now, this is a democracy and voting rights, kind of central. So then the second thing I would say is, I think like a lot of politicians, he wants to be the second coming of FDR, right? FDR is still the most popular president.
He's not doing a very good job.
And no, I mean, we can get into that. You ever want to have me back after this last round around? But no, and so FDR, what is he known for? Dealing effectively with entanglements overseas while rebuilding the American economy. And that seems to be Joe's comfort zone. When he's actually called to be like the best version of LBJ, which is he did those two things, and he passed voting rights and civil rights and dealt with it. So you have to deal with all three. Joe has to, frankly, deal with all three. Well, the reason why LBJ, who I think also wanted to be like FDR, was forced to deal with all three was that the movement wouldn't let him do anything but. And so we have to lean in. That's why I'm so appreciative of all the groups that are keeping pressure on the president right now. We have People for the American Way, the League of Women Voters, the NAACP, Black Women's Roundtable, like all, Color of Change, Stand Up America, like just all these groups, Indivisible, Our Revolution, have to, absolutely keep the pressure on.
Do you think there's a role for threatening to withhold one's vote from Democrats if they continue to pussyfoot around the way that Joe Biden is doing, not just around voting rights reform, but his reneging on his promise to pass George Floyd Act reforms by the anniversary of George Floyd's murder, canceling student debt, any number of promises that he's reneged on. It seems like if even millions of people in the street last summer couldn't get him to fulfill many of his campaign promises, at what point do you think these stakes have to be ratcheted up by activists who are protesting and have signs and are pressuring him, but it doesn't seem to be having an effect?
I think it's the wrong use of privilege to simply say what you won't do. I think you got to use all your privilege and actually decide what you're going to do. And
well, I'm going to vote for a third party candidate,
or I'm going to primary, right? Or I'm going to support somebody who's going to primary.
Right.
So, that's what I would say. I can never encourage anybody not to vote. What I would say is if you don't like, do what I did. Like, I looked at who was running for governor here in Maryland, and I decided to throw my hat in because I couldn't find anybody I was excited about, and I started off in fourth place, and in the primary, I ended up in first by a lot. But, a lot of people laughed when I ran. They were like, what is this kind of like, talking head on TV, Negro Bernie bro dude running for governor of our state? What? and so that's what I would say is like Briahna or any of the other kind of, young activists, like run, and find somebody to back to run, push Cori Bush to run, whatever,
Well,
AOC, whoever anybody wants. It's better to have someone to vote for than them to simply not.
So do you think that one of the progressives should primary Joe Biden if he doesn't follow through on his campaign promises?
That's why we have a primary.
What do you think would be their fate?
I don't know. I mean, I got to tell you, in my primary here, I had two county executives of two of the very largest counties in Maryland. And it was just the only question in the media was which one of them was going to, be the Democratic nominee. I was in fourth as a civil rights activist. I ended up in first by a lot. So you just got to go do it. You just got to go do it. It was not a rational decision, Briahna, when I ran for governor. Any political expert would have told you I was on a fool's errand. Setting aside that we were up against anybody was going to be up against an incumbent. Andrew and Stacey, two old friends and people who I'd organized with when we were young, were up for open seats. We were up against the second most popular incumbent here in the country, and we knew that was going to be tough. But getting to the primary was the first thing, and it was considered a fool's errand. And again, it just what it affirms for me is that nobody really knows who should run until they're running. And then even then, it takes a long time before you get traction. And one of the things we do at People for the American Way with our Frontline Leaders Academy is we train young people to run. And then once they're in office with our Young Elected Officials Network that Andrew Gillum created here 17 years ago, Stacey Abrams went through that program. Pete Buttigieg went through that program. Julian Castro went through that program.
Is not.
But what I'm saying is all these people started off as like activists and people that folks weren't actually thinking as a young Black woman, as a young Chicano man, as a young gay white man, think 20 years ago, were like shoo-ins to be the powerhouses that they are now.
People who listen to this podcast, I got to be honest, aren't big fans of most, if not all, of that list. And the reason is because I just want to say this though. The reason is because that they have in many ways fallen back and are identified solely as a young Chicano man, a young gay man, a young Black woman. And the principles, the veneer of progressivism that made people excited about them to begin with seems to have faded away with their association with Mayor Bloomberg's Mayor Camp and a lot of these institutions that have them out there in the world as a kind of younger, diverse troupe of neoliberals. And so I'm curious about you. I mean, you're someone who, I had a lot of fondness for and affinity for and appreciated your robust support of Bernie Sanders, especially back in 2016 when people weren't doing that. And I was really looking forward to your run, your gubernatorial run. But it did seem to me that you weren't really running so much as a Bernie bro. And I understand that it's Maryland and I understand that it's a different kind of environment. But I was covering 2018 races at the Intercept at the time. And I remember rooting for you, but also feeling like the left energy that might have been behind the campaign, and maybe you didn't feel like it was needed, wasn't going to be galvanized by the way in which the campaign was manifesting. And I wonder what you make of why you ultimately lost in that effort. And I also was curious whether you had any insights from that run about what just went down in Virginia.
I mean, we were the only campaign in the country that ran for state-based Medicare for all. Which is like a massive idea if you actually try.
Wait a minute, didn't Home Slice in Michigan, who also lost, whose name I'm now blocking?
Oh,
Al Said.
Was he state or federal?
It was state. There was a Michigan state, yeah, because what's her name who went to work for the Warren campaign?
That would make sense. He was my fellow Bernie bro, right?
Yeah.
And so I would say that we did run a very Bernie bro campaign, because what that means is that you go kick the beehive of the entire pharmaceutical lobby, the beehive of the whole for-profit medicine machine. I think if you ask, we also ran, on harm reduction. We ran on, a whole bunch of kind of like hardcore harm reduction. We ran on ending mass incarceration and using the savings to fund our public universities. We ran on free community college. I mean, I think if you go right down the line, it couldn't have been, more of an extension of the campaign. Now, of the presidential that had just happened, of the Bernie campaign. What it came down to in the end was that 75% of the voters in Maryland knew who I was, and 100% knew who the sitting governor was. Hmm. And that is a function of your advertising budget at the very end.
Lefties are willing to get to some campaigns. I don't know if you remember, but Bernie Sanders raised more money in this last presidential race than anybody else.
Sure. I mean, Bernie raised hers. We raised, I had more donors than like anybody, ever who would run as a Democrat in Maryland. We had a lower average campaign, average donation. And yet, Maryland doesn't excite people. It's not like, like from around the country. It's just like a regular state. They think of it as being kind of a blue state. We would focus group folks trying to figure out how to, build it. But the bottom line is that I would say we fell about $10 million short from an advertising perspective of what we needed to penetrate the bottom 25%. What we knew, and you can go back and you can look at the Republican, and I kind of go into this detail, how anybody's thinking about running, is that the Republican was afraid of our message because he kept putting out these kind of like soft pedal versions. So I would say, like, I'm for free community college. And then the governor would announce like his own spin on free community college. Or, I would say, I'm for 20% raise for teachers. And then the governor would run an ad saying, I'm for higher salaries for teachers too. He was talking about a 1% COLA. But he would never try to give anybody a reason to figure out who the other guy was in his advertising. And what we knew is that for every 100 voters in that final stretch who learned of our campaign, we won 55 of them to 45. But we did not have the dollars in the final stretch to get to 100% name ID. Generally, in the gubernatorial race, if you can get to 75%, you're where you need to be. But when you're up against a popular incumbent, it's just a different kettle of fish.
We could have a whole conversation about what happened to Maryland and the lessons learned. I mean, I am curious what your take is on McAuliffe's loss.
I mean, right away, what you saw in Virginia was there was just not much enthusiasm for a former governor running for governor again. They have a one-term limit in Virginia. And right away, when he announced, he was trailing Biden by like 10 points.
So why would the Democratic Party do that? If that was obviously true from the get-go, why would the Democratic Party set itself up like that?
We supported Ms. Floyd, People for the American Way. We were all behind Ms. Floyd, who young Black woman, state legislator, I think first Black female grad of the Virginia Military Institute, progressive, endorsed by the unions and our revolution and all of that. And she would have brought a lot more energy. Absolutely. But the big money in the primary, the same money that, for instance, had supported Martin O'Malley, but wouldn't support me, here in the state. The developers who I, generally, characterize as corrupt, because they are in Maryland, weren't trying to write me checks. That class of donor lined up behind Terry because he was good for business for them, and that's just a rational decision that business people make. I get it. I didn't benefit from it because we ran such a progressive campaign, because we were so focused on actually opening up government to everybody in the state and getting beyond old patterns of nepotism and corruption. And Ms. Floyd ran into a similar thing, but she couldn't even get out of the primary. Now, if we had a young Black woman running, enthusiasm would have been much higher. And if you
would say if you had a young Black progressive woman with a good populist policy base running, it would generate enthusiasm.
Yeah, and she was all of that. She was all of that. And yet they've got to have the money, at the end of the day, to like reach the voters who aren't reading the paper, aren't watching the news, are kind of unplugged, focused on their own lives. And again, what we found is that's about a quarter of the electorate in Maryland. And to get to them takes a whole lot of money. And Youngkin, money was never an obstacle for Youngkin. He's a very rich man who was willing to pour his resources into it in a very aggressive way, and ran an insurgent campaign that was well funded. And so that at the end of the day, I mean, trust me, I had words with the Democratic Governors Association, and I'll tell you, Briahna, the point that the establishment, if the establishment's really going to regret not investing in my race because they didn't want a progressive to be governor, It's going to be when Larry Hogan challenges Chris Van Hollen, which looks like it's about to happen. And right now, he would beat Chris Van Hollen by more than 20 points from the polls that we're seeing. You can just look at the Goucher poll that came out. And that's what I told them back then. I was like, I get it. You don't want to support a progressive to take out this sitting governor. You guys kind of like doing business to him. Understand he intends to be president. Understand he will take out one of our senators to get there. And right now, we are looking like we could be in for the most expensive Senate race in this next term. Here in Maryland, nobody's even talking about it. But if you just go look at the polls in the state, you'll see why, and you look at Hogan's ambitions, why it almost seems like a foregone conclusion that he's going to declare. He doesn't have to declare early because he has a big war chest. He can just come right in, and he would start out with like a 20 to 25 point advantage over the Democratic incumbent.
There is so much more I want to talk to you about, Ben Jealous. I want to ask you if you plan to run again. What designs you might have?
I've got a son. I've got a son who really needs his dad right now. He's 9 years old, and he really needs dad at home. I'll get one shot with my son, and I got a daughter who's 15, and she needs dad at home. I got one shot with my daughter. So I tell people, no, I'm not running for office. I am running to crew practice with my daughter, and I am running to guitar practice with my son. And I'm young. Maybe when they're both,
I'm hearing is 9 years from now. Just a couple of election cycles from now.
But the whole world could change, In the meantime, I'm having a whole lot of fun. I'm teaching at the University of Pennsylvania. I love that. It's an easier commute than Princeton. And I'm running people for the American way, and that's a real privilege.
Well, we definitely have to continue this conversation. I really appreciate you taking all this time with me today. Can you let our audience know where they can find you on social media or anywhere else? Yeah,
so at Ben Jealous is the easiest thing, just at Ben Jealous. And again, Briahna, I really appreciate you. This was fun. I hope that we can do it again.
Me too. This is really great. I have so much more to say. We had this whole conversation ran the gamut from, we opened with kind of like a sweeping historical narrative and had a detour and abolished the police way and ended up with some great electoral insights. So you'll definitely have to come back, and maybe we can do our next interview in person.
Absolutely. And if you have time in DC, copies on me. It's too how to say this? It's two old Bernie bros. We should have met a long time ago in a more substantive way.
Well, I love that. Thank you for the time you spent with us today. And to our audience, as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.